Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial on manual texture atlasing. This video will assume that you already have the model ready to be used in VRChat. Texture atlasing is something you generally do as a very last step. Now, as you can see, this model has quite a few materials. I'm not even going to count them, there's just too many. So let's get started. First of all, what you want to do is you want to hide the armature so we can actually see the model a little bit. Go to user preferences. Make sure you have this add-on enabled. You'll need this. Once you have it enabled, you can click Save User Settings in order to save this. Select your mesh. In this tab, it's the Render tab. Scroll all the way to the bottom. You should find Texture Atlas right over here. Just click this to make a new Texture Atlas group. Just name it whatever, it doesn't really matter. Click OK. This is where you'll be selecting your Texture Atlas resolution. I generally don't recommend going over 4000 by 4000 pixels. You can. I personally wouldn't recommend it due to RAM usage. Basically just stay as low as you can. For this model I happen to know that I'm gonna need 4K. You can check the texture resolutions yourself. For example, this one is 500. This one's 500. This one is 1000, so you can basically use this to know how much space you really need on the atlas. If all of your textures are really low quality, then you can probably get away with 1K or 2K. Once you've got this done, you can just click Start Manual Unwrap and then Finish Manual Unwrap. Then when you select your mesh again, you'll see that you have another UV map right over here in the Data tab. Make sure you have the Texture Atlas UV map selected, but you have the camera icon ticked on UV map. What this will do is it'll use the original textures when you're baking the model's textures and baking the atlas. Then next thing you want to do is you want to drag this out. Just create another window. Make sure this one is still here. Just it can be really small. It doesn't really matter. Over here we can set it to UV/image editor. Press tab to go into edit mode. And as you can see, it's a mess. This is what it always looks like. Make sure you have the button at the bottom ticked. It's keep UV and edit mode mesh selection in sync. It'll make stuff a little bit easier. Next, what you want to do is actually I just want to get this out of the way first. It's probably the hair. Yes. You just grab it with G and then press S to scale it down by a lot. What you want to start out with is basically you want to get all of these out of there. So what you're going to do is you're going to select a material. By clicking select, you press G to drag it out, then press S to scale it down a little bit. Don't scale it down like too small, it doesn't really matter. Basically you just rinse and repeat for every material, just like this. Get it all around there. It doesn't really matter. We're going to rearrange this later. This is just so you can see what you're doing. Alright, so now that we have everything laid out like this, we can start manually rearranging this. First, make sure to save often. I save every few seconds. Saving might take a little bit longer if you're in the middle of texture atlasing. Then you just select every material and just drag it back in. Now, you want to give it space on the atlas proportional to both the texture size and how important you think this texture is. Now this is the face texture, which means it's going to be very important. This is what people are going to be looking at all the time. So make sure it's decently big. You can see the texture right over here is 500, roughly 500 pixels high, which means you should be able to fit around eight of these next to each other on the atlas. If you can fit more than that on there, then that means they're too small. So make sure just it's something you get the hang of eventually. You can use your fingers to make manual adjustments. You can see how large it is. Right now, I think this is actually a little bit larger than it needs to be on a 4K atlas, but that's fine. As long as it's not too large. You generally want to give the more important parts a little bit of extra leeway. That way you won't run into any problems later on. The eyes are also similarly sized, so we can just keep them like this. These are the body textures. Now these needed a little bit more detail, so I'm actually going to make them twice as big. Just put them in this corner. Now what you can also do, you can use either border select with B or circle select with C to select parts that you want to put closer together. You don't have to leave the islands as they are. You can just like move this a little bit closer together and make the atlas a little bit more efficient. You can even rescale individual parts like these fingernails. That doesn't really matter. Oh, got a little extra vertex over there. Yeah, these are the underpants. Guess these underpants are more detailed than the face, but you're not really gonna see them, so I'm just gonna put them right here. Now, one thing to remember, texture atlasing, as you might be able to see, it doesn't have to be a very precise process. As long as all the textures fit on there and nicely and big enough, we'll be making adjustments later. It doesn't have to be super tight or anything. You don't have to spend ages on this. The most important part is that you're doing it. This one is a lot smaller, so we can just put it over here. Now, you might actually run into some problems while you're moving these. For example, you might select like the skirt and you'll find out that some other stuff also gets selected. I'll show you how to fix that at the end of the video. You can just go there. If you're struggling with that right now, you can check the description for a timestamp. Let's see, these are the ribbons. Not very important. Just put them right over here. The skirt actually needs to be a little bit bigger, probably. That's fine. Ooh, these are pretty large. As you may have noticed, I probably didn't need an atlas of this size. You can also try going with an atlas that's 4,000 pixels wide to 2,000 pixels high, but that's going to give you a few other issues, such as the UVs being like stretched out. They're going to be twice as wide without being higher. You can manually fix that, but it's gonna take a little bit more time. And this is the hair. Because the hair over here was like this. This means that the hair will probably need a little bit more space on the atlas than it might seem. So I'm just gonna put it right here. One reason why you don't want to make the UVs too large on the atlas, for example, make the face take up literally half the atlas, is something I'll show you later. This can introduce some very ugly seams on your model when you're too far away. Once you think you've got everything laid out roughly okay-ish, you want to go back to the render tab. You want to go to bake. You want to set the baking mode to textures, and you want to increase the margin based on how large your atlas is. For 4K atlases, I always set mine to 32. For 2K, I set mine to 24. And for 1K, I just leave them at 16 pixels. These margins are really important. I'll show you the effect of having too small margins later. So for now, just hit bake. This is going to take a while, but you can see that it's going to bake all the textures into the atlas using the original UV maps. Now, one thing I have noticed is that I don't know if it's going to be an issue, but the first time you bake your atlas, all the transparent bits will be black for some reason. I don't really know why this happens. I'm assuming it's a bit of a bug while clearing the current image. It doesn't really matter. What you can do is you can just bake again. You're bound to bake again at some point anyway. So once this finishes baking, we'll just have a look. Now as you can see, this is the baked result. You just want to go over all textures, make sure they're getting enough detail. Some people recommend, like, oh, this is the inside of the mouth, you're not going to see this very often, you might as well make this smaller. I wouldn't recommend that unless you have a reason to. Like, if you're actually running out of space on the atlas, that's something you could consider. These are the eyes, eye highlights, extra. This all looks fine. It's a lot of this is probably a lot bigger than it has to be, but that doesn't really matter. Yeah, I think this mostly looks fine. There's a lot of unused space, but as I said, it really doesn't matter. It just ignore that. I'm personally, actually, it's not something that's really important to me, but I'll have to resize something at some point for demonstration purposes. These are probably slightly too small, so just scale them up a little bit. Same for this one. The eyes all look fine. The face looks fine. These extra effects also look fine. Same for the hair. Maybe move this a little bit closer. Now, as you can see, around all the UVs, you'll see this extra texture space that kind of bleeds out into the open. These are the margins I was talking about earlier. What these margins do is they help prevent seams. Now, if these margins were really small or non-existent, this part would not even exist. But what that would do is it would give you very, very bad seams down the middle of your face. What some people like to do is they like to select the face. Oh yeah, by the way, this is going to look like a horror show while in the middle of the atlasing process. Some people like to select, for example, like one tangent and then just marking the seam. You can do that and then re-unwrap the face to prevent those seams, but it takes up more space on the atlas. It's not something that I would recommend. It doesn't really matter. For now, I think this is fine. If this is your first time, it probably won't be very fine. It'll take a long time to get right. Just give all the textures a little bit of a look and see if they're as big as they should be. These might actually be too small. Are they? Nah, that's probably fine. And then just hit bake again. As you can see, the texture has actually been properly cleared this time, so the transparent bit should work. We'll just give this a little bit more time to bake. Alright, this all looks fine. So now what you want to do is, first of all, I want to save. I haven't done it in a while. What you also want to do after this step, which is very, very important, you always want to keep a copy of your model that doesn't have any removed materials yet, basically an atlas copy. I think right now is the best time to make that copy, so you just go to File, Save Copy. It doesn't really matter what you call this, just call this whatever you want, just as a reference. So that way, if you figure out you messed something up on the atlas, you can always just go back and fix it. And then rebake, etc. So now that we have this, we can go to Image, down there at the bottom, click Save as Image, just call it, it doesn't really matter what you call it, just give, I'll call this Sakuya Atlas, Save as Image. Now that you have this saved as image, you can go back into object mode, you can close this second window. As you can see, it's still looking pretty horrible, we're gonna fix that. Go to materials and just start deleting all the materials. Next you want to add a new material, call it Atlas, it doesn't really matter. I like to set the color to white over here. That's just so it looks the same, set it to shadeless. Then over here, with this material selected, you go into texture, you go to new, you can just call it Atlas texture or whatever. Down here at image, you open the image, then you open the atlas that you made before. Okay, so this is looking pretty decent. There are some few issues that I'm going to show you, and I'm also going to show you how to fix that. It's going to look fine in Unity. But if you really want it to look okay in Blender and check it, you need to scroll down. Under Influence, at the texture settings, tick Alpha. And then go back to the material, tick Transparency, make sure it's set to Z Transparency, and then just drag the alpha down to 0. And we'll have our model. Completely atlas, completely texture atlas, looks fine. The inside of the skirt is missing, that's... If you press N, I probably have backface culling turned on, I don't know why. That's fine. It's gonna look fine in Unity. So just save this. And you just make sure to inspect every part of your model a little bit, make sure you're happy with the results. Yeah, these details look fine. It all looks fine. Generally, texture atlasing is supposed to be a lossless operation, resulting in no loss of quality. If you are losing quality, you should probably head back and open your copy again and just try it again. Keeping copies like those will save you a ton of time. Now, one last thing you need to do, you need to select your original UV map, because if you just export it like this, it's going to look like this in Unity. What you want to do is you want to select this UV map, delete it, and optionally, you don't have to, rename this one back to UV map, and then just save it. Now your model should be ready for export, so you go to File, Export, FBX. You can also use the cat's FBX export, by the way. Now, I have a preset that's very close to the cat's one. Something that I always like to do, I don't think Cat Blended Tool does this. At the FBX export settings, you need to set path mode to copy, and you need to tick this little box. That way all the used textures will be embedded inside the FBX file, and when you import the FBX into Unity, Unity will also automatically find and assign all the textures. That way you don't have to copy them over manually. And you don't have to copy over the atlas manually, and you could also send like this FBX to a friend, and they'll be able to, like, with only the FBX, they'll be able to work on and use the model as well. So just export this. Now we're pretty much done in Blender. So we'll just go over like a few tiny steps in Unity. We're just gonna go over to Unity and check it out real quick. Alright, so one last thing. I know most of you will probably already know how to import a model into Unity, so I'm not really going to show you how to do that. I just want to show you some tiny little things that you want to make sure that you've got right after atlasing. Especially when you're dealing with larger atlases like 4K or maybe even 8K atlases, there are some settings that you need to set correctly in order for this to work. So I'm just importing the model right now. Right, as you can see, because I exported the FBX with the correct settings, it has already generated this texture, as well as the model itself. I don't have any shaders on this yet. The first thing you need to look at is, if your atlas is larger than 2K, you need to set the maximum size higher to whatever your texture size is. I set mine to 4000, so I'm going to set mine to 4K. I'm also going to enable alpha as transparency. I don't think it really matters, but it's a good thing to do. Oh, I guess it did do something. Just give this a proper shader. This is the shader I always use. Lighting looks really bad right now. That's fine. I don't really care. Right. Now, this should be pretty much it. Your model should be ready to go after this. You've got the texture set up. Everything should just work as it is. If you're bringing a if you're atlasing an existing model and replacing the FBX, what you probably want to do is you want to delete all old materials. I'm just going to show you with this one right now. Right-click the model and hit re-import. This will re-import the model and regenerate the materials. This will help clean up your materials folder, because after you atlas you really don't need those old materials anymore. One last thing you need to consider is texture sizes. Now, especially when working with larger atlases, you don't really need to mind this when working with 2K, but with 4K or 8K, when you click on your texture in the inspector, down here you can see the texture size. For 4K textures it's almost always going to be 21.3 megabytes, which isn't too bad, but that might be more memory that you realistically need to take up. So what you can do is either duplicate your texture or just work on the original one. I'm going to duplicate this one for now. Call it crunched. One technique you can apply is crunch compression. Now this will take a little bit of time to set up and to do it first. Just use crunch compression, set the quality to 100, doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter. If you set the quality lower, it'll look worse, it'll compress faster, and it'll be smaller. But crunch compression is already so good that it doesn't really matter. Just leave it at 100, save yourself the quality loss. Now, crunch compression is lossy, which is one reason why you wanna leave everything on the atlas just a little bit bigger than you need it to be, unless you're really working in tight spaces like 1K. Crunch compression helps reduce RAM usage and loading times, but it will not decrease VRAM usage. So that's just something to consider. VRAM is generally not a very scarce resource in VRChat. RAM actually might be for lower end systems. And download times can be pretty large, especially with the upcoming update that will make avatar loading smoother but slower. You just want to squeeze out every last second of loading, so people don't spend like 3 minutes loading your avatar. Alright, so now that this is done crunching, we can take a look at how big the resulting texture is. It's 1.9 megabytes, which is more than 10 times smaller. Now, when we go to the material and select the texture, we can switch between them. Just get up really close by holding Alt right click. Now, it doesn't really matter as much in VR anyway, because VR resolutions generally aren't high enough to see these, but you can I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there's definitely a slight amount of JPEG-ish compression here. In most cases it won't really matter. It's a trade-off between quality and loading times. Because having crunched compression will save a little bit of RAM. It won't save VRAM. It'll save a little bit of RAM and save a ton of loading time. So yeah, that's one more thing you can do with large atlases. I think that just about covers all the stuff in Unity. So after this we'll be looking at potential problems you can run into mostly in Blender. Now in this part of the video I'm going to be covering some edge cases, or tiny little problems or large problems that you might run into. The first one I'm going to talk about is what if you select a material and it turns out to only be a single vertex on the UV map, even though it's a complete like mesh in 3D view. If you try to bake this, you'll find that it just won't bake. There's really nothing to bake, it's just a single vertex, there's not even a face. What some people like to do is they try and find a piece of color on the baked atlas that matches the color given. But there's an easier and more reliable way to solve this problem, which is with this material selected, make sure edit mode is in sync. Move your mouse into the 3D view, hit U, then press unwrap. This will re-unwrap the selected mesh. Now this will look a little bit messy most likely, that's fine. This should bake normally. I'm just gonna move this a little bit closer, I don't think it matters. This should bake normally now, and because it's one solid color, this usually happens if it's a solid color, you can just make it really, really small. Don't make it infinitely small, but like make it pretty small. Then when you press bake, this one should have the correct colors baked in. Same for this one actually. This seems to be the buttons on the shirt. One more thing to consider, this doesn't always work, as you can see here. That's usually because you need to mark seams, but instead of doing that, because we only need like the colors anyway, we're going to press U and use the Smart UV project unwrap instead. You can leave these settings as they are, it doesn't really matter. And it'll have neatly unwrapped the buttons. Well, not very neatly at all in fact, but that doesn't matter. We can make this equally small, really small in the atlas. This is a 2K atlas, so it could probably be this big. And then when you press bake, these should also be baked correctly. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Now, another thing that you might run into, especially on on certain kinds of models that don't have too many polygons, is that vertices can be shared across materials, which means that if you select one material and try to move it in the atlas, you'll find that you're also going to be stretching out a lot of the other materials. You really don't want this to happen. Unfortunately, I haven't really found a really good way to fix this. What you can do is you can untick UV. Keep UV and mesh edit selection mode in sync. Select the material individually, then select it again on the atlas, and then you can freely move, scale, and rotate it any way you want. Just put it anywhere, and just put it anywhere on the atlas where you want. You can check if you're still if it's not accidentally overlapping by temporarily checking this button. It's not, so I can leave it as it is. And I could also move this other one, same problem. Just untick this, move this, put it back, too close, move it over here, yeah, and now it's fine. So that's how you solve that. Another thing you might run into, either at the middle of atlasing or right before that, you find a material that for whatever reason or another you don't really want to atlas. For example, these frills. I've had this problem where no matter what I did, the UVs were just so bad that I couldn't get them on the atlas right. So what I did for this one, and what you can also do, for example, to keep transparency on certain materials, is at any point you can select all the vertices belonging to this material. Oh, actually, let me just turn on the keys real quick. Key display. Here we go. At any point, you can select this material, press P to separate the current selection into a new mesh. Then go back into object mode, and you should have a separate mesh containing just the object that you don't want to atlas. If you were already in the middle of atlasing, you need to go ahead and just delete the texture atlas UV map. This will leave the mesh. This will restore the mesh to its original status if nothing happened. One more thing that I recommend doing is going to user preferences and enabling this add-on, material util specials. Just enable it, save user settings. Once you go to the materials, there's all these unused materials. What you can do is you can click this drop-down box, go to clean slots, clean material slots. This will remove all unused materials. You can do this on both meshes, and then everything should be fine. And then afterwards, once you're done atlasing, what you need to do is you need to make sure. Actually, let me just demonstrate this right now. Just gonna save the image. I didn't mean to do that. Oh well, that's fine. You can save the image. You can just delete all the materials, etc. You can add new material. I'm not really gonna worry about the details too much. Alright, then once you've got that done, like you're done atlasing, you need to delete the original UV map. You need to rename the texture atlas UV map back to UV map, so that when you merge these two meshes, you can select both of them by holding shift, then pressing Ctrl J. Now as you can see, you're left with one mesh. This is the atlas material, but you're also still left with this separate material. And yeah, that's pretty much how you do that. This just about concludes everything you need to know about manual texture atlasing. I hope this video was useful to you. I hope this will make your models just a little bit more optimized. Thank you for watching. See you next time.